The elderly couple was informed by the military that their son had suddenly passed away under unclear circumstances. Many years later, when they opened the coffin, they were shocked. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Ivan." Liliana's voice barely broke through the hush of the cold morning air, but Ivan heard it just fine. He always heard it. It was the same weight in her voice, the same tremble, the same exhaustion. 2 years, and nothing had changed. He pulled his coat tighter, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. She looked smaller somehow, wrapped in her old wool shawl, her hands buried deep in the folds of her dress. He wanted to say something, maybe offer a word of comfort, but what was left to say? There were no words for this kind of sorrow. Their boots crunched against the frozen earth as they made their way up the narrow path toward the cemetery. The wooden fence creaked in protest when Ivan pushed it open, the sound familiar, like an old companion waiting to greet them. And there it was, his grave, the place where their son lay beneath the earth, sealed away in that damned zinc coffin, faceless and unreachable. 2 years. 2 long, miserable years. Liliana knelt by the headstone, her hands moving with practiced care as she brushed away the dried leaves that had gathered there. Ivan remained standing, his fingers tightening around the matches in his pocket. He should light the candle. He should kneel. He should say something. But all he could do was stare at the name etched into the stone, his chest tightening like a vice. Anthony Ivanovich. Son. Soldier. Forever loved. They had never seen his face, never touched his hand one last time. They had only been given a box, nailed shut and wrapped in sorrow, and a few empty words from the men in uniform. A hero, they had said, died for his country. What did that mean to parents who had lost their only son? What was the use of a hero when he was nothing more than a memory? Liliana placed a small loaf of bread and a handful of candy beside the candle, the way she always did, as if Anthony might somehow reach up from the grave and take them. As if he was still here. Ivan sighed, finally bending down to strike the match. The tiny flame flickered, fighting against the wind, but it held. He placed the candle carefully on the grave and watched the wax begin to melt, pooling at the base like a slow, quiet tear. And then, a sound. A rustling, just beyond the next row of graves. Liliana froze, her hand still on the stone. Ivan turned sharply, his body tensing, years of instinct kicking in. For a moment there was nothing but silence, the kind that pressed against your skin and made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Then, movement. A small shape, huddled near the base of another grave. Ivan narrowed his eyes, stepping forward carefully. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something wild. When he got close enough, he stopped, heart stuttering in his chest. A wolf pup, thin, ragged, shivering. Its fur was patchy, its ribs pressing against its sides. It must have been starving. But it wasn't the state of the animal that made Ivan hesitate. It was its eyes. There was something familiar about them. The pup looked up at him, ears pressed flat against its skull, body curled in on itself like it was waiting for a blow. But it didn't run. It didn't growl. It just watched him, its golden eyes locked onto his. Behind him, Liliana gasped. "Ivan," she whispered. "It looks just like him." He didn't have to ask who she meant. Anthony. Ivan swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. It was nonsense, of course. A wolf was a wolf, and their son was buried 6 feet under. But for the first time in 2 years, something inside him shifted, a tiny crack in the wall of grief he had built around himself. Liliana was already moving, kneeling down, reaching out despite the cold. The pup flinched but didn't flee, watching her with wide, cautious eyes. When she touched its head, it let out a small, weak whimper, the sound so heartbreakingly familiar that Ivan had to look away. Ivan wasn't sure why he agreed to bring the wolf home. Maybe it was the way Liliana held it so carefully, whispering soft reassurances as if it could understand her. Maybe it was the look in its eyes, something far too knowing for a creature so young. Or maybe it was simply because he was too tired to argue. Either way, Hunter became a part of their home that day, nestled against the old rug by the fireplace, barely moving except for the slow rise and fall of its breathing. For the first few nights, the wolf pup barely made a sound. It ate what little they gave it, huddled close to the warmth of the fire, and flinched whenever Ivan moved too suddenly. But as the days passed, something in its posture changed. It no longer cowered in the corners, but instead began to watch, its golden eyes flicking between Ivan and Liliana as if studying them, learning their habits. It followed Liliana from room to room, curling at her feet when she sat by the fire, pressing its head into her lap when she whispered Anthony's name in the quiet of the evening. Hunter was not like any animal Ivan had ever seen. It was too aware, too still at times, as though waiting for something only it could sense. At first, Ivan tried to ignore the unease creeping up his spine, but then the strange things started happening. It was the third week after they brought Hunter home when Ivan first heard it, the sound of movement just beyond the house. At first, he dismissed it as the usual noises of the countryside. The wind rustling through the trees, a rabbit scurrying beneath the porch, the occasional hoot of an owl from somewhere deep in the woods. But that night, something felt different. The sound was too deliberate, too measured, like someone stepping carefully through the frost-covered leaves, not wanting to be heard. Lying still in bed, he listened. Liliana slept soundly beside him, her breath slow and even, completely unaware of the way Ivan's body tensed. Across the room, Hunter's ears twitched. The wolf had heard it too. It lifted its head, eyes locked on the door, body alert but silent. Ivan sat up slowly, careful not to wake Liliana. He reached for the old rifle resting against the wall, his fingers tightening around the familiar wood of the stock. Moving as quietly as he could, he stepped toward the window, pushing the curtain back just enough to see outside. The yard was empty. The moon cast long shadows across the frozen ground, but there was nothing, no movement, no sign of life. He scanned the tree line, half expecting to see a fox darting between the branches, but there was only darkness. Still, that feeling remained. The next morning, Ivan found footprints in the frost. They weren't his, and they sure as hell weren't from any animal. The prints were human, leading from the forest's edge to the porch before disappearing back into the trees. Someone had been there, standing outside their home, watching them while they slept. A few days later, it happened again. Ivan had spent the afternoon splitting firewood, the steady rhythm of the axe striking against the logs, keeping his mind occupied. The air was crisp, the scent of burning wood drifting from the chimney, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. But then, as he wiped the sweat from his brow and straightened his back, he saw it. Just beyond the trees, where the light of the setting sun barely reached, something moved. It was quick, just a flicker of motion between the branches, but it was enough to make Ivan's grip tighten around the axe handle. He squinted, trying to make out the shape, but by the time he focused, it was gone. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the light, his mind playing games on him. but the unease settled deep, curling in his stomach like a sickness that wouldn't fade. That evening, he told Liliana about the footprints and the figure in the woods. She listened, her fingers curling around the edge of her shawl as she sat by the fire, her expression unreadable. "You think someone's watching us?" she asked after a long pause. "I don't think, Liliana. I know." She exhaled, shaking her head. Maybe it's just a hunter passing through. Ivan wished he could believe that. He truly did. But something in his gut told him this wasn't some lost hunter or wandering traveler. This was something else. It was late afternoon when the knock came. 3 firm raps against the wooden door. Ivan looked up from his seat, his hands still resting on the half-whittled piece of wood in his lap. He hadn't been expecting anyone, and neither had Liliana, judging by the way she froze in the kitchen, her fingers tightening around the handle of the kettle. The knock came again. Ivan set down the carving knife, pushing himself up with a slow, measured breath. Something in his bones told him this wasn't just a neighbor stopping by. Something was about to change. When he pulled open the door, he found himself staring at a woman, a stranger, standing there in the dimming light, her face half hidden beneath the hood of her coat. She wasn't old, maybe mid-20s, with dark, tired eyes and a stiff posture, like she wasn't sure whether to stay or turn back. But it wasn't her presence alone that set off the unease curling in Ivan's stomach. It was the child she was holding. A small girl, bundled in a thick wool blanket, her tiny hands gripping the fabric as if clinging to something unseen. Her eyes, large, deep-set, unnervingly familiar, met Ivan's, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Liliana appeared beside him, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression shifting from curiosity to confusion. "Who?" The woman cut her off, her voice quiet, but firm. "She's your granddaughter." Silence filled the space between them. Ivan felt the weight of the words settle over him, heavy and suffocating. His fingers tightened on the doorframe. Liliana took a step forward, her breath hitching. "What did you say?" The woman lifted her chin slightly, meeting Liliana's eyes. "Her name is Tanya. She's Anthony's daughter." The name struck like a hammer to Ivan's chest. Anthony. Their Anthony. The son they had buried. The boy whose grave they visited, whose name they spoke only in whispers, afraid of how much it still hurt. Liliana's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes already brimming with tears. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible." Wordlessly, the woman reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. She held it out to Ivan. He hesitated before taking it, unfolding the thin paper with trembling hands. His eyes skimmed over the words, searching, hoping for some kind of mistake. But there it was. Tanya Antonievna Ivanova, daughter of Anthony Ivanovich Ivanov. The breath left his lungs. The date of birth. The place. It all matched. Liliana swayed beside him, clutching at his arm. "My God, Ivan," she choked out. She looks just like him." And she did. Too much. Same dark, thoughtful eyes. Same curve of the jaw. Same solemn expression that Anthony had carried even as a boy. Ivan forced himself to look up at the woman. "Where's her mother?" She hesitated, shifting the child slightly in her arms. "You're looking at her." Liliana sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers tightening around his sleeve. "Why are you only bringing her now?" Ivan asked, his voice like gravel. The woman swallowed. "Because I can't keep her anymore." The words were like a slap. Liliana stiffened beside him. "What do you mean you can't keep her?" "I mean exactly that," the woman said, her voice raw but unwavering. "I have my own life to figure out, and I can't do that with a child. She's better off here." with her family. Ivan felt something hot and bitter rise in his chest. You're just going to leave her? Like this? The woman flinched, but didn't back down. I don't have another choice. She bent slightly, lowering Tanya onto the wooden porch. The little girl stood still, not moving, not crying, just watching with wide, unreadable eyes. Liliana's mothering instincts took over instantly. She knelt beside the child, brushing a stray curl from her face. Sweetheart, she whispered, do you know who we are? Tanya blinked, then gave a tiny, hesitant nod. Liliana let out a choked sob and pulled the girl into her arms, holding her like she was something fragile, something breakable. The woman, Tanya's mother, stepped back, her gaze lingering on the scene for only a moment before she turned. I have to go. Ivan's jaw tightened. That's it? You show up after all this time, drop a child at our feet and just leave. The woman paused at the bottom of the steps, but she didn't turn around. I'll send money when I can, she said quietly, but don't expect me to come back. Then, without another word, she disappeared down the path, swallowed by the evening fog. Ivan stood at the doorway long after she had gone, watching the place where she had vanished, his fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to be angry, to yell, to demand answers, but none of it would change the fact that she was gone. And now, Tanya was here. Liliana hadn't let go of the girl, still kneeling, still holding her like she might slip away too if she loosened her grip even slightly. Ivan exhaled heavily, running a rough hand down his face before crouching beside them. Tanya was looking at him again, that same steady, unblinking stare. She didn't seem scared, just quiet, waiting. Ivan cleared his throat. You hungry? A small pause. Then the girl nodded. Liliana pulled back just enough to cup Tanya's face in her hands. You're safe now, sweetheart. We're going to take care of you. Tanya blinked slowly, like she was processing the words, then nodded again. Liliana pressed a trembling kiss to her forehead before lifting her into her arms, carrying her inside. Ivan followed, shutting the door behind them with a quiet click. Ivan hadn't set foot this deep into the forest in years. The air was damp with the lingering chill of early morning, thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. Hunter moved ahead of him, its body low to the ground, nose skimming the underbrush as if following a trail only it could sense. The further they walked, the heavier Ivan's chest felt, as though each step carried the weight of something unseen pressing against his ribs. He had spent so long ignoring the strange things that had crept into his life. The footprints outside the house, the shadow lingering at the edge of the trees, the way the wolf always seemed to be waiting for something. But after what he had seen the day before, after the warning from those men, he could no longer shake the feeling that he had been purposefully kept in the dark. His grip tightened on the strap of his rifle slung across his back as the trees thinned out, revealing a clearing ahead. In the middle of it, almost swallowed by vines and moss, stood a small run-down cabin, the wood darkened with age, its roof sagging slightly under years of neglect. Ivan's breath slowed, his pulse quickening as his eyes scanned the structure. He had passed through these woods countless times in his life, but he had never seen this place before. Hunter stopped just a few feet away from the door, its ears pricked forward, body still, except for the slow rise and fall of its chest. It didn't growl. It didn't bark. It simply waited. Ivan wasn't sure why, but the sight of that made his stomach twist even tighter. He stepped closer, his boots crunching against the frost-laced ground, the sound of it far too loud in the silence that surrounded him. As he reached the porch, the old wooden boards groaned under his weight. He raised a hand, hesitating for a moment before pressing his palm against the door. It wasn't locked. Before he could decide whether to knock or push it open, a noise came from inside. A faint creak, like someone shifting their weight on an unsteady floorboard. His breath caught, muscles tensing as the door slowly swung open from the inside. A figure emerged from the dim interior, stepping into the pale morning light, the movement unhurried, almost cautious. The man who stood before Ivan was thin, his features worn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. His clothes were old, loose in places where they had once fit better. His posture guarded but unmistakably strong. He looked like someone who had been forced to survive on his own for far too long. But none of that mattered, because despite the weight of the years, despite the tiredness carved into his face, despite the changes that time had etched into his features, Ivan knew exactly who he was looking at. His son, Anthony. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Ivan stood frozen in place, gripping the strap of his rifle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He could hear his own breathing, heavy and uneven, the pounding of his heart like a drum against his ribs. He wanted to speak, to say his son's name out loud, to reach for him just to make sure he was real. But his body refused to move. Anthony stood just a few steps away, shoulders tense, his face unreadable. He had changed, thinner than Ivan remembered, his face sharper, his posture wary, like a man who had spent too long looking over his shoulder. His clothes were worn, his hair longer than it had ever been. But there was no mistaking him. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, until finally Anthony let out a slow breath. "I knew you'd come," he said quietly. The words hit Ivan like a punch to the gut. How? How could he have known? And why had he never come home? "You should be dead," Ivan said, his voice rough, his throat dry as if the words themselves were painful to say. Anthony's gaze flickered, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "I was supposed to be." Ivan felt his stomach tighten. He stepped forward, gripping Anthony's arm before his son could pull away. The warmth of living flesh beneath his fingers sent a jolt through him. "This isn't possible. I buried you. I stood at your grave." Anthony exhaled sharply, but didn't try to move. "You buried an empty coffin, Father. I was never inside it." Ivan's grip loosened. His thoughts raced, pieces of the past rearranging themselves in ways he never imagined. The locked casket, the refusal of the military to let them see the body, the strange cryptic condolences from the officers who had come to their home. At the time, he had been too broken to question it, too consumed by grief to see what was right in front of him. "They lied to you," Anthony continued, voice steady, as if he had rehearsed these words in his head 1,000 times. "To everyone. They needed me dead. Or at least, they needed the world to believe I was." Ivan took a slow breath, forcing himself to think. Why? Anthony hesitated for just a second before stepping back, motioning toward the cabin. "It's not safe to talk out here." Inside, the cabin was small, barely more than a single room with a rough wooden table, an old stove, and a cot pushed against the wall. It was sparse, but it was clear Anthony had been here for a long time. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like gun oil. Hunter padded in after them, circling once before settling near the door, its eyes fixed on Anthony like it had found its rightful place. Ivan didn't sit. He couldn't. His body was too tense, his mind too restless. He watched as Anthony moved toward the table, pressing his hands against it, shoulders rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. Then, at last, he spoke. "The mission wasn't what they told us," he began, his voice low, steady. "We weren't deployed to fight an enemy. We were sent to eliminate our own. It was a cover-up, a way to silence people who knew too much. When I realized what they were doing, I tried to stop it. That's when they turned on me." Ivan's stomach churned. "They tried to kill you?" Anthony gave a short, humorless laugh. "Not right away. They wanted information first. I was held for months, questioned, tortured. When they couldn't break me, they decided it was easier to make me disappear. So they staged my death, put my name on a list, and buried an empty coffin in my place." Ivan clenched his fists, rage simmering beneath his skin. He had spent 2 years mourning a lie, believing his son had died a hero when, in reality, he had been hunted by the very people he had served. "How did you escape?" Anthony's eyes darkened. "Not alone. There were others, men like me, soldiers who had seen too much. Some of them didn't make it, but I did. I ran, hid where I could, stayed ahead of them as best I could. Then I found Hunter." His gaze flickered to the wolf. "Or maybe he found me. Either way, we've been watching over you and Mother ever since." Ivan swallowed hard. "All this time, you were right there?" Anthony nodded. "I couldn't let them know I was alive. If they thought you knew the truth, you and Mother would have been in danger." A deep ache settled in Ivan's chest. He understood why his son had stayed away, but it didn't make the loss any easier to bear. He had missed years with his boy, stolen from him by men who played God with other people's lives. But now, Anthony was here, and Ivan wasn't about to let him slip away again. "You can't stay out here forever," Ivan said, his voice quieter now, steadier. "It's time to come home." Anthony tensed, shaking his head. "It's not that simple. If you found me, then so can they. And if they do, they won't just come for me this time. They'll come for you, for Mother, for Tanya." Ivan's breath caught at the mention of the girl. "You know about her?" Anthony's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've known since the day she was born. I knew the moment that woman left her with you. I wanted to come then, but it wasn't safe." Ivan stared at him, realizing that even in the shadows, his son had never stopped watching over them. "Then what do we do?" Ivan asked. "You can't keep running forever." Anthony exhaled slowly. "No, I can't. But I'm not going to let them control my life anymore. If I'm ever going to have a chance at a real future, I need to end this. I need to make sure they never come for us again." The walk back to the village felt longer than usual, the weight of what Ivan had just learned pressing down on his chest like a stone. His son was alive. Alive, but hunted. Alive, but trapped in a past that refused to release him. Every step Ivan took, he felt the danger closing in. It was no longer a question of whether they were being watched. He knew they were. As he neared the outskirts of the village, his instincts screamed at him to be careful. He adjusted the bag over his shoulder, forcing himself to walk at a steady pace, to act like nothing was out of place. The last thing he needed was to draw attention to himself. But when he turned onto the main road leading toward his home, his pulse quickened. A car he didn't recognize was parked near the well. It was clean, too clean for a vehicle that belonged to anyone in the village, its black paint glinting under the dull afternoon light. 2 men stood beside it, talking to a few of the villagers, their body language relaxed but calculated, like wolves waiting for the right moment to strike. Ivan kept walking, forcing himself not to react, though every muscle in his body begged him to run. As he passed, he heard one of the men ask in a low voice, "Ivan Petrovich." Do you know where he lives?" The villager hesitated, shifting on his feet. Ivan didn't wait to hear the rest. He turned the corner, quickened his steps, and within moments his house came into view. That night, Liliana noticed the change in him immediately. "You're quiet," she murmured as she set a steaming bowl of soup in front of him. "What happened?" Ivan shook his head. "Nothing," he lied, but she knew better. She reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his rough skin. "You think I don't see it? Something's coming, Ivan. I can feel it." He looked at her then, at the lines of worry etched into her face, at the years of loss and waiting reflected in her tired eyes. He swallowed hard before finally saying, "We need to leave this place, Liliana. All of us." Her breath caught. "Leave? But this is our home. It's not safe anymore." Liliana didn't argue. She just held his gaze, nodding slowly, because deep down, she had known this moment would come. Across the room, Tanya sat on the floor, running her fingers through Hunter's fur. The girl had been different lately, quieter than usual. Ivan had caught her staring off into the distance more than once, her brow furrowed as if lost in thought. She looked up then, her small voice breaking the silence. "I know who he is." Ivan and Liliana turned to her, their confusion evident. Tanya hesitated for only a moment before continuing. "The man in my dreams, the one I've been seeing." Ivan felt his throat go dry. "What man?" She looked down at Hunter, her tiny fingers curling into the thick fur. "My father." Liliana inhaled sharply. Ivan stared at her, his mind racing. He had never told her. No one had. But somehow, Tanya had known. "I heard you talking," she admitted softly. "And I dreamed about him. I saw his face." She paused, then lifted her chin, her expression unreadable. "I want to meet him." Ivan let out a slow breath, his hands tightening into fists beneath the table. It wasn't safe. None of this was safe. But deep down, he knew there was no stopping it now. They had waited too long already. By the time Ivan had gathered supplies and made a plan, it was already too late. The first gunshot shattered the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots crunching against gravel. Ivan moved without thinking. "Liliana, take Tanya. Go to the back room. Don't come out until I say so." She didn't argue, grabbing the child's hand and rushing toward the hidden space behind the old wooden cabinet. Ivan reached for the rifle he had kept tucked away for years, his fingers steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He moved to the window, peering through the crack in the curtains. A group of men stood outside, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light of the lanterns they carried. Then came the knock. Slow, deliberate, a taunt disguised as politeness. "Ivan Petrovich," a voice called out smooth and unhurried, and, "We know you're in there. Let's not make this difficult." Ivan didn't move. His grip on the rifle tightened. Another knock, harder this time. "Come now. You've already met us once. You know why we're here. Just hand him over, and this doesn't have to end badly." Ivan's jaw clenched. "Go to hell." A slow chuckle. "You're making a mistake, old man." The moment stretched, thick with tension, and then a blur of movement. Hunter lunged from the shadows, a snarl ripping through the night. The sound of a man's scream pierced the air, followed by the chaos of gunfire and shouting. And then another figure emerged from the darkness. Anthony. He moved fast, his body low, his weapon drawn. He fired once, twice, striking one of the men before ducking behind the side of the house. Another shot rang out, splintering wood near the window where Ivan stood. The fight had begun. Inside, Liliana clutched Tanya close, whispering quiet prayers as the sounds of battle raged outside. She didn't know what was happening, only that the man she loved and the son she had lost were out there, fighting to keep them safe. Tanya trembled against her, her small hands gripping the fabric of Liliana's dress. "Mama," she whispered. Liliana pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We stay quiet, my love. We wait." And so they did. They waited as gunfire echoed through the village. They waited as the past and present collided outside their door. And when the silence finally came, when the world seemed to hold its breath, they waited for whatever came next. Because no matter what happened tonight, they couldn't stay here anymore. The scent of gunpowder still clung to the night air as Ivan tightened his grip on the rifle. The house still stood, but it wouldn't for long. They had been found, and once the enemy knew where to look, they would return. Stronger, more prepared, more determined. Anthony was the first to speak, his voice low and steady. "I have to go, alone. If I leave now, they'll follow me instead of you. It's the only way to keep you safe." Ivan's answer was immediate. "No." Liliana clutched Tanya's small hand, her knuckles white. The child didn't cry, didn't flinch, just watched, her dark eyes seeing more than they should have. Anthony exhaled, jaw tight. "If I stay, they'll keep coming. They don't care about you or Mother. They want me." Ivan's voice was steel. "And if you go? What happens then? You keep running until they finally catch you?" Silence. They both knew the truth. Running only delayed the inevitable. "We leave together," Ivan said, unwavering. "All of us. We disappear." Anthony hesitated. "That's not... It's final." Something in Ivan's tone made Anthony stop. He stared at his father for a long moment before exhaling, surrendering in the way his shoulders dropped slightly. Liliana spoke quietly. "I'll start packing." They took only what was necessary: food, warm clothing, a few personal belongings. Ivan wrapped an old coat around Tanya's small shoulders, pulling the hood over her dark hair. She looked up at him, her lips parted. "Are we going home?" His chest tightened. He brushed a rough hand against her cheek. "Not yet, Lyubimaya, but we'll find a new one." She nodded, accepting the answer without question. They moved quickly, slipping past the life they were leaving behind. The village was silent, but Ivan knew better than to think they weren't being watched. They were always being watched. As they passed the cemetery, Liliana slowed. She bent down, plucking a single white flower from the frost-covered ground. She stepped toward the grave that had carried Anthony's name for 2 long years. Gently, she placed the flower against the cold stone. A farewell, not just to the past, but to the pain that had come with it. Then, without another word, she turned and followed the others into the darkness. They traveled for days, moving through the countryside with no real destination, only the desperate need to keep moving. Anthony changed his appearance, cutting his hair short, growing a beard to mask his features. His posture shifted, the way he carried himself different from the soldier he had once been. He became someone else, someone the world wouldn't recognize. Tanya never left his side. She clung to his hand, afraid he would disappear again if she let go. And in the quiet moments when they stopped to rest, she would lean against him, tracing the lines of his palm, memorizing him. One night, as they sat around a small fire, she finally spoke. "Will we go back one day?" Anthony looked at her, at the flickering firelight in her eyes. He didn't answer immediately. Then, softly, "I don't know." She considered this for a moment. then nodded. "I think we will." And somehow, he believed her. Months passed. They found shelter in a quiet, forgotten part of the country, a place where the past couldn't follow them. The house was small, worn from years of neglect, but it was enough. For the first time in a long time, they were safe. Tanya thrived, her laughter slowly returning in the safety of their new home. Liliana and Ivan adjusted, though the weight of what they had lost never truly left them. They lived carefully, cautiously, always aware that the danger hadn't disappeared, only distanced itself. And Anthony. He tried to live like a ghost, a man without a name, without a past. But even as he blended into the quiet life they had built, he knew the past wasn't done with him. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, he stood at the edge of the land, staring out at the horizon. The fight wasn't over. The men who had hunted him would not forget. But this time, he wasn't alone. This time, he had something to fight for. The wind stirred through the grass, carrying the scent of the coming winter. Anthony squared his shoulders, his hands curling into fists. He had spent years running. Now, it was time to stop. This story is a powerful journey of survival, sacrifice, and redemption. Ivan's unwavering love for his son, Liliana's quiet strength, and Anthony's struggle between the past and the future create a deeply emotional and gripping narrative. Through their hardships, we see the resilience of family bonds and the cost of truth. The story teaches us that no matter how dark the past is, hope and love can still lead the way forward. It reminds us that true strength is not in running from fear, but in facing it together. Ultimately, home is not a place, but the people we fight for. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.